At my daughter's wedding, she opened my gift, smirked, and tossed my check onto the floor. Gasps spread across the hall, silverware clattered against china, and every eye turned toward me. That single motion, cold and sharp, cut deeper than any words could. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. My name is Robert. I am 70 years old, and this is what truly happened. The sound of the string quartet filled the hall, light but steady, every note like a thread holding together the fabric of celebration. Laughter rose and fell in waves, bouncing off the high ceiling, weaving through crystal chandeliers. I sat in my chair, shoulders straight, hands resting on the polished wood table, my eyes fixed on the glowing stage where my daughter shined in her gown. The scent of vanilla buttercream drifted from the cake standing tall in the corner, mingling with the dry bite of champagne and the faint perfume of roses arranged in gold-trimmed vases. It was a scent that should have carried joy, but to me it carried weight. Fairy lights sparkled overhead, casting warm beams that bounced across sequins and silk dresses. Guests posed for photographs, smiles wide, their polished shoes gliding over the marble floor. Everything looked perfect, but perfection has a way of hiding fractures. I leaned back against the stiff chair, the fabric pressing into my shoulders. I had slipped a simple envelope into the gift box earlier. Inside, a check, folded with care. Not grand, but meaningful. A father's gesture, a blessing written in ink. The hall grew louder as the bride and groom finally sat down at the head table. She glowed under the lights, veil pinned neatly behind her hair, every inch the image of elegance. One by one, she opened cards and envelopes, thanking the guests, her voice sweet and practiced. Then her hand paused over mine. The paper tore. My daughter's eyes scanned the numbers, and her lips curved, not with gratitude, but with contempt. "This?" she whispered, just loud enough for those near her to hear. Her groom chuckled, leaning close, and then she did it. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the check onto the floor. The sound of it landing was barely a whisper, but the reaction thundered. Gasps broke across the hall. One woman covered her mouth. Another man muttered, "Unbelievable." Chairs shifted, forks dropped. The music faltered. I stared at the paper on the floor, the ink glaring under the lights. My daughter didn't look down. She sipped her champagne, her face cold, as if my offering, her father's gift, was nothing but trash. Slowly, I reached forward. My fingers brushed the edge of the check, the texture crisp against my skin. I folded it once, tucked it into my pocket, and straightened my jacket. Not a word left my mouth. Not yet. But silence can be sharper than anger, and in that silence, every gaze found me. They waited for me to break, but I would not. This was her day, yet she had chosen humiliation. What she did not know was that her cruelty had set into motion something she could never undo. The check was back in my pocket, but the insult lingered like smoke that refused to clear. The whispers spread through the hall, each one sharper than the clink of glassware. Some guests tried to pretend they hadn't seen what happened, focusing on their food. Others leaned across tables, voices low, eyes darting toward me and then back to the head table. I didn't move. My hands rested on the table, fingers laced, steady. The humiliation burned beneath my skin, but my face remained calm. My daughter had chosen her stage, and she believed she had silenced me. She couldn't have been more wrong. The air thickened with the perfume of roses, sweet yet suffocating. I glanced at the 5-tier cake in the corner, the buttercream gleaming under the lights. A child ran past with a balloon, his laughter piercing through the tension. Life carried on around me, but inside something shifted. I remembered when she was little. She once drew me a picture of our old house in Dallas. She left space for the oak tree I planted myself, and even scribbled in the swing I hung from its branches. She handed it to me with crayons still on her fingers, and said, "Daddy, this is home." That memory pressed against me like a weight, sharper now because of the woman she had become. I had worked for decades to make sure that house stayed in the family. Overtime shifts, missed weekends, repairs done with my own hands. I built a trust, investments, even bought 2 rental properties in Houston so my children would never worry. I thought loyalty was mutual. I thought love carried forward. The groom leaned over, whispering in her ear, and they both laughed. His cufflinks gleamed, polished silver catching the chandelier's light. He had married into a family he thought he could control. I saw it in his smile, calculating, thin. He had her ear now, and in that ear he had placed poison. I took a sip of water. The glass was cool against my lips, steadying. Across the hall, my sister caught my eye. She shook her head, her mouth tight. She had warned me before. She said, "Robert, she doesn't value what you've given. She only values what he tells her to." I had brushed it off then, believing blood was thicker than influence. Now I wasn't so sure. The crowd had returned to their meals, but every so often eyes flicked toward me, waiting, measuring. Some expected anger, others expected shame. What they didn't expect was patience, because patience is the quiet edge of revenge. I slid my hand into my jacket, fingertips brushing the folded papers I had carried with me. Not just the check, but documents. Real ones. County Court Record Number 2025 CV 11873, notarized and sealed. A trust agreement. Property deeds. Bank certifications. They were heavy, not in weight, but in consequence. No one at that table knew. Not my daughter. Not her groom. Not the guests still sipping champagne. The check was nothing more than a test, and she had failed spectacularly. The groom raised his glass, his voice cutting through the hum. "To my beautiful wife," he said, smiling broadly, "the start of a future built together." The guests applauded. My daughter leaned her head against his shoulder, her smile radiant again, as though she hadn't just crushed me in front of them all, but my future, the one they had dismissed, was about to reshape theirs entirely. I set my glass down carefully, the sound crisp against the wood. I adjusted my suit jacket and stood, my chair scraping against the floor. The quartet faltered again. A hush rolled outward, slower this time, deliberate. Guests turned. My daughter's eyes met mine, her smile slipping, her glass freezing in her hand. I didn't rush. I let the silence grow, thick and heavy, until it pressed against every wall of the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice firm, steady, carrying over the music, "I have an announcement to make." The microphone was already in the groom's hand. He had used it for his toast, his voice cracking with rehearsed charm. Now he looked at me as if I had no right to ask for it. His jaw tightened, his smile stiffening. I extended my hand, palm open. "May I?" I asked calmly. The groom hesitated, his eyes flicking to my daughter. She gave a slight nod, though her lips tightened as if she had bitten into something sour. Reluctantly, he handed me the microphone. The cool metal rested in my grip. I lifted it slowly, scanning the hall. Eyes locked on me, one table after another. The buzz of chatter had died. Only the faint hum of the speakers filled the air. I cleared my throat once. "Thank you," I began, voice steady, deep. "I won't take long." A murmur rippled, guests leaning closer. "I've sat quietly tonight," I continued, "watching my daughter marry, watching her begin a new life, and I've seen something I did not expect." The bride shifted in her chair, her gown catching against the polished floor. Her fingers drummed against the stem of her champagne glass. The groom smirked, clearly certain that nothing I said could wound him here, in front of his audience. I let the silence hang. Then I reached into my suit jacket. The sound of paper unfolding was soft, but it sliced through the hall. I held up a single document, its seal glinting under the chandelier light. "Some of you may know," I said, "that I've spent my life building something. Not for myself, but for my family. Savings, properties, a trust fund. My hope was to pass it down to those who respected what it meant to earn." A woman at the second table gasped. Another guest leaned back, whispering, "Inheritance." I nodded slightly. "Yes, inheritance. I came here tonight prepared to celebrate with a symbolic gift, a check." I let the word linger, my eyes moving to my daughter. "A gesture of goodwill, one that was dismissed before all of you." The guest shifted uneasily, glancing at her. My daughter's cheeks flushed, though she forced her chin higher. "The check you saw," I said, "was never the true gift. It was a token, a measure of respect. Respect, however, is not a one-way street." I placed the microphone closer to my lips, my voice cutting sharper now. "County Court Record number 2025 CV11873, I read slowly. "Filed and signed by Notary Public. A legal reassignment of my trust and assets." The room stilled. The words were heavy, unfamiliar to most, but the weight of them was clear. I held up the document. "This paper states that my daughter and her new husband will no longer be beneficiaries of my estate. Effective immediately." Gasps surged again, louder this time. A few guests covered their mouths. The groom's smirk vanished, his eyes wide, his knuckles whitening against the table edge. My daughter's lips parted, her face paling under the bright lights. "Dad," she whispered, the word breaking. I didn't look away. "Instead," I continued, "the trust will pass to those who have honored me. My grandchildren, my sister's family, and a portion to a local foundation in my late wife's name." Whispers became waves. Chairs turned, guests leaning forward, their gazes snapping between me and the bride. The groom pushed up from his chair, his voice strained. "You can't do this. Not here. Not now." I looked at him steadily. "It's already done." I held the document higher, letting the seal catch the light. "Signed, filed, sealed. The law does not bend to arrogance." The bride's hands shook as she set her glass down, liquid spilling over the rim. Her eyes glistened, fury and disbelief colliding. "This was supposed to be your blessing," she hissed. "Not this." I let the silence answer her. Then I placed the microphone gently back on the table and stepped away. The wedding hall was no longer their stage. It was mine. The weight of my words settled over the hall like a storm cloud refusing to break. Guests who had come for music and laughter now stared at me, hushed, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. A hall meant for joy had turned into a courtroom, and my evidence lay in plain sight. The quartet in the corner had stopped playing altogether. One violinist lowered her bow, her eyes wide, lips parted as though she had forgotten how to breathe. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, steady but tense, filling the void where music should have been. I turned slightly, letting my gaze sweep across the crowd. Faces I had known for decades now studied me as if for the first time, some with pity, some with respect, some with the sharp glint of scandal shining in their eyes. The groom's voice cracked through the silence. "This is ridiculous," he said, rising halfway out of his seat. His tie shifted against his chest, and sweat gleamed along his temple. "You can't just make a spectacle of us." I lifted the document again, steady, unflinching. "Spectacle?" I said calmly. "The spectacle was made the moment my daughter threw away a father's gift in front of you all. I am simply finishing the scene." A ripple of whispers rushed through the tables. The bride's voice broke through them, sharper than glass. "Dad, stop this. This is my wedding, my night." I let my eyes rest on hers. Her veil shimmered in the light, but her face was drained of its glow. The hand she lifted trembled. She wanted me to back down, to shrink as she had expected me to do earlier, but I did not. "This is your wedding," I said, "and your actions defined it. Not my words, not my choice, yours." I folded the document once more and slid it back into my jacket pocket. The movement was deliberate, every eye tracking it like a judge sealing a verdict. "You see," I continued, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air, "respect isn't a word, it's a currency. You spent yours cheaply tonight." A few guests nodded. One older man at the back clapped once, softly, before stopping under the weight of so many stares. The groom slammed his hand against the table. "You're humiliating her!" he shouted. "No," I said firmly. "She humiliated herself." The words landed heavy, undeniable. My daughter's lip quivered, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She looked at her guests, her friends, her new husband, but no one rushed to her side. I stepped away from the head table, my shoes pressing into the carpet with measured calm. I stopped by the center of the hall, between the rows of tables, where every guest could see me clearly. "I came here tonight," I said, with my heart open. "I came as a father, a man who sacrificed for decades so his children would never worry about tomorrow. That gift, those years, were not enough for her, and so they will go to those who remember what family means." My voice carried to the back of the room, where even the children sat still, their parents' hands tightening on their shoulders. I let the microphone fall to my side. For a moment, the hall was nothing but silence. Then, softly, like rain starting on a tin roof, applause began. Not from everyone, but enough. My sister, my nephew, a few family friends who had seen my struggles, my late wife's sacrifices. Their claps grew stronger, overlapping until they filled the silence with something else entirely. Recognition. My daughter sat frozen, her eyes glistening, lips pressed tight. The groom pulled at his collar, face red, anger mixing with fear. I did not smile. I did not bow. I only stood, calm, letting the moment breathe. Because tonight, justice had been served at her own wedding. The applause rose, fractured but steady. It wasn't a roar, but it was enough to carve a line through the tension that gripped the hall. Each clap was a verdict, each nod a confirmation, and every sound pressed deeper into the silence at the head table, where my daughter sat pale, her groom stiff as stone beside her. The fairy lights above no longer seemed warm. They glared instead, exposing everything that words could not hide. The roses on the tables smelled stronger now, heavy and cloying, like perfume left too long in a closed room. I stood in the middle of it all, the check still in my pocket, the papers still sealed, my dignity intact. The groom leaned into the microphone he had abandoned moments earlier, his voice forced into a shaky calm. "Everyone, let's remember, tonight is about love. Tonight is about celebration. Let's not get distracted by unnecessary drama." But his words were paper thin, and everyone in the room knew it. He was trying to plaster over a crack that ran the length of the wall. My sister's voice rang out from the third table. "Love doesn't throw away blessings." It wasn't loud, but it carried. People turned. She looked straight at my daughter, her expression both pitying and stern. The bride's eyes filled with tears, but not of remorse, of anger. Her nails dug into the tablecloth, pulling at the white fabric until threads stretched under her grip. I drew a breath, slow and deliberate. "I will say one more thing," I told the guests, lifting the microphone again. Every head turned back. "This trust," I said, my hand brushing my jacket where the papers lay, "was created not just from money. It was built from time, from sacrifice, from years of labor and loyalty. Those who honor that, receive it. Those who mock it, lose it." I let the weight of the words linger. Then I turned slightly, facing my daughter directly. "You made your choice." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She glanced toward her husband, but even he seemed lost, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting across the tables where whispers swirled like wildfire. I lowered the microphone. "That's all I have to say." I walked back toward my table, my steps measured, the wood floor firm beneath each stride. Guests shifted as I passed, some patting my shoulder lightly, others nodding in approval. Even those who stayed silent followed me with their eyes, no longer looking at her, but at me. The DJ at the corner fumbled with his laptop, his voice shaky over the speakers. Let's bring the music back. Time to dance, everyone." But when the music returned, upbeat, bright, it clashed with the air in the room. Couples hesitated before stepping onto the floor. Laughter felt strained, movements stiff. The celebration had been cracked down the middle. I sat once more, sliding the check from my pocket. I unfolded it, staring at the numbers written in my own hand. Not large compared to my estate, but enough to sting when it hit the floor. I set it back on the table in front of me, untouched. Across the hall, my daughter's gaze met mine. Her eyes shone with something between fury and regret. But she said nothing, because deep down she knew this wedding would be remembered not for her vows, not for the cake, not for the music, but for the moment her own father turned humiliation into judgment, and that judgment was sealed. The music carried on, but it no longer belonged to the celebration. It was background noise, hollow and misplaced. Guests swayed politely, their steps stiff, their laughter thin. Every glance flicked back toward me, then toward the bride and groom, as if waiting for another scene to unfold. I leaned back in my chair, the wood pressing into my spine, hands folded on the table. My plate sat untouched. The roast chicken's steam had cooled, the butter on the rolls stiffened. I was no longer hungry, not for food, not for small talk. I was hungry only for silence, for the moment to sit in peace after years of giving. The groom excused himself from the head table, tugging at his collar as he stepped aside. I watched him move across the room, his phone already in his hand. He ducked near the bar, muttering into the receiver, his face tightening as though the ground beneath him was shifting. Perhaps he thought he could undo what was already filed, already notarized. He was wrong. County court records do not bend to whispers, not to last-minute pleas, not to charm. My daughter sat alone, her veil slightly tilted, her shoulders rigid. She dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, though no tears had fallen. The glow she had worn all day dimmed under the light of consequence. She looked smaller now, like the little girl who once clung to my leg at the county fair in Houston, afraid of the Ferris wheel. Only then I lifted her up and carried her until she felt safe. Now she had chosen to push me away in front of all, and the ground would not rise to meet her. My nephew, seated near the back, lifted his glass toward me. A small gesture, but clear. A recognition. I nodded once, acknowledging the bond that respect secures, the loyalty that carries through blood when love is honored. The DJ raised the volume, trying to drown out what could not be erased. The bass rattled the glassware, the beat hollow against the tension. Children danced near the cake, their joy untouched by the drama. For them, this was still a party. For everyone else, it was a reckoning. I rose once more, this time without a microphone. I didn't need it. The hush spread naturally, rippling outward as I moved toward the center of the hall again. The music faltered as the DJ's hand slipped. Silence returned. I lifted the check between my fingers, holding it for all to see. This, I said, my voice clear enough to reach the far wall, was never about money. It was about respect. Tonight, you all witnessed what respect looks like when it is thrown away. The bride closed her eyes, her jaw set tight. I placed the check back onto the nearest table. It is no longer mine to give, nor hers to receive. Let it sit here, empty, like the bond she broke. A woman at the second table whispered, "He's right." Another man muttered, "I've never seen anything like this." The groom returned from the bar, his phone still clutched in his hand. His face was pale now, the bravado gone. He stopped short when he saw me standing firm, the guest's eyes on me instead of him. "You'll regret this," he said through clenched teeth. I met his gaze without flinching. "The only regret in this room belongs to you." The murmur rose again, a tide of voices swelling, circling, breaking against the edges of the hall. And for the first time all night, I allowed myself a quiet smile, not of triumph, but of clarity. Because my daughter and her husband had not just lost an inheritance. They had lost the one thing they could never buy back: honor. The night pressed on, but the wedding no longer breathed the way it should have. The string of events had changed the air, and every guest knew it. Conversations were clipped, laughter strained, glasses raised only halfway before being set down again. I remained at my table, watching the swirl of uneasy faces. The smell of champagne had gone flat, like bubbles, escaping a bottle left too long uncorked. Even the roses on the tables seemed to sag, petals drooping under the weight of the moment. My daughter tried to recover, forcing a smile as she mingled among her friends. She pulled at her gown, lifted her chin, and pretended nothing had happened. But the way people looked at her gave her away. They didn't see a glowing bride anymore. They saw the woman who tossed her father's gift aside. Her groom, meanwhile, stalked the edges of the room, checking his phone again and again. He whispered to a groomsman, shaking his head violently, as if trying to spin control back into his hands. But no whisper could undo legal filings. No charm could soften the stamp of a notary seal. At one point, he passed close by me. He didn't meet my eyes, but I heard him mutter under his breath, sharp as a knife, "Old man thinks he won." I didn't answer. Some battles don't require words. Silence is enough when the truth already speaks. The DJ called the bridal party to the dance floor for the traditional family dance. The crowd clapped politely, but their eyes betrayed hesitation. Who would step forward? Who would dare? My daughter stood in the center, bouquet in hand, waiting. She looked toward me. Whether out of habit, expectation, or desperation, I couldn't tell. For a heartbeat, the hall held its breath, watching. I stayed seated. Her lips trembled, barely parting. The groom stepped in, forcing a grin as he wrapped an arm around her waist. They danced stiffly, the music bright but brittle, the rhythm failing to disguise the weight pressing on their shoulders. Guests clapped at the end, but the sound was uneven, broken. No, one forgot what had already been said. As I watched, I thought of traditions, of how in many weddings, the father of the bride gives her away, his blessing the bridge to a new life. But tonight, I hadn't given her away. She had thrown me away, and in doing so, she had severed a tradition older than any contract. My sister leaned over from her table, her voice low but firm. "Robert, you did the right thing." I nodded once. It wasn't revenge. It was truth. She gave a sad smile. Sometimes those are the same. I let my eyes fall back on my daughter. She tried to laugh with her friends again, but the sound didn't carry. She was a bride in a white dress, surrounded by roses and tomatoes, but the celebration no longer belonged to her. The celebration belonged to the lesson, and that lesson had only just begun. The dance floor emptied slowly, guests shuffling back to their tables, the clapping fading into scattered murmurs. The DJ pushed for energy, his voice upbeat over the speakers, but it landed flat. The hall had shifted, and no rhythm could bring it back to what it was. I sat quietly, watching the edges of the evening unravel. The champagne tower sat half-drained, flutes smudged with fingerprints. The buttercream cake still gleamed, but no one hurried for a slice. Conversations had turned hushed, broken into small knots of whispers. The groom reappeared, his phone still in his hand, his face pale under the golden lights. He leaned toward my daughter, speaking quickly, his gestures sharp. She shook her head, her eyes wet, her hand trembling as she clutched the tablecloth. From across the room, I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the panic. It struck me then. Their future was already built on sand. Tonight, all I had done was pull away the tide that kept it hidden. A young cousin passed by my table, his voice hushed. "Uncle Robert," he said, "I just want you to know, I respect what you did." His words trembled, but his eyes were clear. I nodded once. Respect is earned both ways. He swallowed hard and walked back to his seat, leaving me in thought. I reached for the water glass before me, condensation cold against my fingertips. The ice had melted, the taste flat, but it steadied me. I thought of my late wife, her soft voice, her quiet strength. She would have sat beside me now, her hand folded over mine. She would have reminded me that dignity cannot be stolen unless it is given away. The memory tightened my chest, but it also strengthened me. Part of tonight's choice, the redirection of the trust, was in her honor. I had left a portion in her name, assigned to a foundation we once supported in Dallas, a children's shelter. She always believed in protecting those without family, and tonight her memory reminded me that blood does not guarantee loyalty. The groom raised his voice suddenly, snapping me back to the present. "He doesn't get the last word," he barked, his hand striking the table. "This is our night." Guest turned again. The bride tugged at his arm, whispering frantically, but his temper broke through. He grabbed the microphone from the stand and glared at me across the hall. "You think you've shamed us?" he shouted. "All you've done is show everyone who you really are, a bitter old man trying to buy respect." A few gasps rose, the crowd caught between disbelief and fascination. I did not move. Slowly, I stood, my chair sliding back with a muted scrape. My hands rested calmly at my sides, no anger in my face, only resolve. "You misunderstand," I said, my voice carrying even without the microphone. "Respect cannot be bought, but it can be lost. And tonight, you've both proven how easily it slips from your hands." The groom's grip on the microphone trembled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His fury had burned out, leaving only silence. The bride stared at me, her expression breaking, the pride stripped away. For a flicker of a second, I saw the little girl again, the one who once ran barefoot in the yard, hair tangled, smile wide. But that image was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the woman who had mocked me before all. I took a slow breath. The air smelled of roses and champagne, but beneath it lingered the sharper scent of endings. Traditions were meant to bind families together. Tonight, that bond had been severed, and in that severing, a new legacy was written. The groom lowered the microphone at last, his shoulders heaving, his face flushed with defeat. He had tried to wrestle the room back under his control, but the hall no longer belonged to him or to her. The weight of truth had settled, and there was no lifting it. I stood steady, watching him falter. The murmurs swelled, shifting against him now. Guests exchanged looks, not of sympathy, but of judgment. In every whisper I could hear the verdict forming. This man, this new husband, was unworthy of the trust he craved. My daughter sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white, her veil sliding off her shoulder. She stared down at the table as though it might swallow her whole. The bouquet she once carried with pride lay abandoned near the floor, petals scattered where laughter had once reigned. The DJ tried again, raising the volume of the music, desperate to bury the tension, but the melody sounded wrong, hollow against the silence still clinging to every corner. It was like fireworks in a funeral, bright, loud, and painfully misplaced. I took a step closer to the center of the hall, not to raise my voice, not to shame her further, but to make one thing clear. Tonight, I said evenly, was meant to be a day of beginnings. But beginnings are built on truth, on honor, on respect. When those are absent, no ceremony, no vow, no signature can make them whole. The room seemed to hold its breath. I reached once more into my jacket and withdrew a smaller envelope sealed with a simple strip of tape. I held it between my fingers, raising it so all could see. "This," I said, "is a copy of the reassignment, a notice that has already been filed with probate court. Every word, every seal, every line is legal and binding." The groom flinched as though struck. The bride's lips trembled, her eyes filling again, but still she said nothing. I placed the envelope on the nearest table, beside a glass of champagne that had gone flat. "It will remain here tonight. Anyone who doubts me may read it for themselves." A man at the far table whispered, "He's not bluffing." Another voice answered, "No, he's finished this already." The tide had turned fully now. What was once humiliation had become judgment. Not on me, but on them. I stepped back, my hands loose at my sides, my heart steady. For years I had worked, sacrificed, given, and for a moment tonight I had been cast aside like nothing. But dignity does not stay broken when truth is spoken aloud. The bride finally rose from her chair. Her veil slipped to the floor, her gown dragging heavily as she stood. Her voice was soft, fragile, but the hall caught every word. "You've ruined this day," she said, her voice breaking. I looked at her, my expression calm. "No, you ruined it the moment you mocked what you did not understand. I only revealed the cost." Her breath caught, her eyes darting desperately to her groom, to her friends, to the guests who now sat in heavy silence. No one reached for her, no one lifted her hand, because tonight the lesson had already been written, and tomorrow the weight of it would follow her into every corner of her new life. The hall no longer glittered the way it had when the evening began. The fairy lights overhead still shone, but they seemed harsher now, their glow exposing every fracture left behind. The roses on the tables had begun to wilt, their petals curling in the heat. Even the buttercream cake, still untouched in the corner, looked like a monument to a night that had soured. I remained standing at the center of the hall, the envelope resting on the table beside me. It wasn't just paper. It was the symbol of everything I had worked for, everything I had protected, and everything they had just thrown away. The groom finally lowered his head, his bravado gone. His phone slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, screen shattering. He didn't bend to pick it up. He only stood there, shoulders sagging, his future collapsing around him. My daughter stared at me, her eyes red, her lips trembling. For the first time all night, she looked as though she wanted to speak. Not in anger, not in pride, but in desperation. But she didn't. She knew the truth had already been carved into stone. I took one last look around the room, at the guests, who had come for joy and found themselves witnesses to something far heavier, at my sister, whose gaze told me she understood, at the young faces of my grandchildren, who would one day know the truth of why this night mattered. Then I reached for the check in my pocket, the very one she had tossed to the floor. I placed it gently back on the gift table, atop the stack of envelopes. "I came here tonight to bless my daughter's future," I said, my voice carrying steady across the room. "But blessings cannot survive contempt. What you saw tonight was not the end of my love as a father. It was the end of my silence." The words hung in the air like a closing bell, final, unmoved. I stepped away, walking slowly toward the doors of the hall. The music had stopped again. My shoes pressed against the carpet, each stride echoing louder than any violin or toast. Not a single voice called after me. At the doors, I turned once, just long enough to leave the last words they would hear from me that night. "Celebrate your union," I said. "But remember, some gifts, once thrown away, can never be given back." And with that, I left. Behind me, the music did not restart. The laughter did not return. The party continued only in shadows, stained by the silence I had left behind. Because the night was no longer theirs. It was mine. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments.